Let's be real. Most modern cars are like smartphones on wheels, packed with tech that's designed to glitch right after the warranty expires. But old Fords, they were built when durable meant you could drive through a snowstorm, hit a pothole the size of a bathtub, and still make it home in time for dinner. Which Ford would you trust if you had to bet your life on it starting every morning? Stick around, because some of these machines could probably outlive you. 1966-1977 Ford Bronco, first gen. Before the Bronco became a shiny status symbol, parked outside yoga studios, it was Ford's gritty answer to the Jeep CJ and International Scout. This was a real-deal utility vehicle, designed for ranch hands, hunters, and anyone who thought road was just a suggestion. Simple? Absolutely. Tough? Like a steel anvil in a fistfight. The first-gen Bronco was built with a straightforward inline-six or small-block V8, paired with a manual transmission and solid axles that didn't know the meaning of fragile. The Dana 44 front axle could take punishment that would snap the suspension of modern SUVs like pretzels. Even better, there was no complex electronics, no fragile sensors, just mechanical parts you could fix with basic tools and a strong cup of coffee. It came in 3 body styles: wagon, half-cab pickup, and roadster. No matter which you picked, the bones were the same. The base 170 cubic inch straight six made just 105 horsepower, but it would run for decades on nothing more than oil changes and the occasional tune-up. The optional 289 or 302 V8s added some grunt without cutting into reliability. Rust was the only real enemy. Keep the frame clean, and this thing would outlast its owner. Parts interchangeability was another ace in its pocket. Ford reused components across models so you could walk into almost any parts store and find what you needed on the shelf. Today, pristine first gens can go for $50,000 or more, but even beat-up ones with more rust than paint will fire up and drive. That's not nostalgia talking, that's mechanical reality. The first-gen Bronco wasn't built to impress your neighbors. It was built to survive whatever you could throw at it, and then keep going for decades. 1987-1996 Ford F-250 and F-350 with the 7.3 IDI diesel. Forget the fancy Power-Stroke turbo diesels. Before those came along, Ford stuffed something even more unstoppable into their heavy-duty pickups. The 7.3-liter International Harvester IDI diesel. No turbo, no complicated electronics, just raw, farm-grade engineering meant to work in the harshest conditions. This indirect injection beast made 180 horsepower and 338 pound-feet of torque. By today's standards, that's nothing special, but here's the thing. It wasn't designed for speed, it was designed to last. These engines often crossed the 500,000-mile mark without major repairs, and some even rolled past 1 million. The secret? The overbuilt bottom end and simple mechanical fuel injection system. No computer to fail, no fragile high-pressure injectors, just a rock-solid pump and glow plugs that could be replaced in your driveway. The injection system sprayed fuel into a pre-chamber, meaning lower pressures and less stress on the engine components. It was slow to warm up, but once running, it would happily pull a trailer through a blizzard without breaking a sweat. The trucks themselves were built just as tough. The transmissions, whether the C6 automatic or ZF5 speed manual, were built to take years of abuse. The Sterling 1025 rear axle was nearly indestructible. Maintenance was simple: oil changes, fuel filter swaps, and the occasional valve adjustment. That was it. Sure, the bodies would rust, because Ford in the 80s wasn't exactly a champion of corrosion prevention, but the drivetrain, practically immortal. Even today, you'll still see these old F-250s and F-350s hauling loads on farms, construction sites, and logging roads. They're loud, they ride like you're sitting on a wooden bench, and they accelerate like they're towing an anchor. But when the world ends, don't be surprised if the last vehicles running are cockroaches and 7.3 IDI-powered Fords. 1965-1973 Ford Mustang with the 200ci inline six. Everyone drools over the V8 Mustangs, the K-Code 289s, the Boss 302s, the big block monsters. But if you're talking about a Mustang that's still running after 60 years, you're looking at the humble 200 cubic inch inline six. The so-called Secretary Special turned out to be the cockroach of the Mustang world. This engine was an evolution of the Falcon's rock-solid 170 Ci6, stretched for more torque and fitted with a 7-main bearing crankshaft that was massive overkill for the power it made. The result was 120 horsepower and 190 pound-feet of torque. Nothing to light your hair on fire, but enough to cruise at highway speeds without straining. The real reason these engines lasted so long? They weren't abused. The V8 cars got raced, hot-rodded, and generally thrashed. The 6-cylinder cars were driven to work, church, and the grocery store by owners who treated them gently. No burnouts, no street races, no constant redlining, just easy miles. Everything else on these cars was just as straightforward. The 3-speed manual transmission was agricultural in its simplicity. The C4 automatic was nearly unkillable with this low-torque motor. The 8-inch rear end, more than strong enough. And because Ford loved parts sharing, many components are still easy to find today. Even rust didn't kill them as fast as it did their heavier V8 siblings, which strained the suspension and frames more. As long as you changed the oil, swapped spark plugs occasionally, and kept rust at bay, this engine would just keep ticking. Today, these 6-cylinder Mustangs are often overshadowed at car shows, but they're survivors. Find one that hasn't been hacked up for a V8 swap, and chances are it'll fire right up and drive across the country. It may not win any drag races, but it might just outlive the cars that do. 1992-1997 Ford F-Series with the 300ci inline six. By the early 90s, the Ford 300ci inline six was a dinosaur. Overhead valves, push rods, and a design dating back to 1965. But it was the kind of dinosaur that could pull your house off its foundation and still be idling happily afterward. The 300 was famous for its low-end grunt, with 145 horsepower and 265 pound-feet of torque coming on just off idle. It was perfect for hauling, towing, and slogging through mud. Farmers, contractors, and fleet operators loved it because it was simple, reliable, and cheap to maintain. In its final years, Ford added fuel injection, but kept it dead simple. A throttle body setup that any mechanic could diagnose with a basic multimeter. The block and head were solid chunks of iron. The timing gears, not a chain, not a belt, never needed replacement. The integrated intake manifold reduced gasket failures, and the engine bay was roomy enough to work on with one hand while holding a cup of coffee in the other. These trucks could return 20 km/h on the highway in a full-size pickup, and because they shared so many parts with other F-Series models, repairs were straightforward. The bottom end was easily good for 500,000 miles with regular oil changes. Sure, the bodies would rust because Ford still hadn't mastered corrosion prevention in the 90s, but the drivetrains were essentially immortal. Even today, you can find these trucks on farms, still hauling hay bales, pulling trailers, or idling at a job site, like it's 1995 all over again. The 300ci6 wasn't fast, but it was loyal, and if you're the kind of person who values a truck that will run badly longer than most engines run at all, this was your holy grail. 1970-1979 Lincoln Continental Mark III FARF. When you think bulletproof Ford products, a giant luxury Lincoln probably isn't the first image that comes to mind. But the Continental Mark III, A4, and V were built like rolling bank vaults. Heavy? Absolutely. Over-engineered in every possible way. Under those endless hoods lived Ford's 460ci big block V8, a monster designed to loaf along at highway speeds, barely above idle. In the early 70s, it made 365 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque, but even as emissions laws choked the numbers later in the decade, reliability actually improved thanks to lower compression and milder cam profiles. Less stress meant longer life, The rest of the mechanical package was just as tough. The C6 automatic was the same heavy-duty transmission used in trucks. The 9-inch rear end was legendary for its strength. Even the accessories, like the power window motors, were built as if they'd be installed in industrial machinery. Yes, the cooling system could be marginal on hot days, but an upgraded radiator solved that. The massive frames resisted bending. The thick steel body panels laughed off door dings. And while the plush interiors looked delicate, they were made from real leather and wood, not the fragile plastics that plagued later luxury cars. These Lincolns were designed to protect Ford's luxury reputation. That meant they had to work, every time, for decades. Whether the owner was a bank president or a mob boss, maintenance was straightforward. Change the oil, keep the coolant fresh, and you could cross the country without a hiccup. Today, the Mark III 5 is one of the few 70s luxury cars you can still find driving to car shows under its own power. Sure, they're big, they're thirsty, and they're about as subtle as a parade float, but when it comes to old-school durability, they're the Cadillac fighters that just wouldn't quit. 1980-1996 full-size Ford Bronco. While early Broncos get all the collector hype, the full-size models from 1980 to 1996 were the true workhorses. Built on the F-Series truck platform, these Broncos were as tough as the pickups they were based on. Just shorter, squarer, and with a removable rear roof section that made them feel like giant convertibles for people who actually owned toolboxes. Engines. You had options. The 300ci inline-6 for fleet buyers who valued reliability over speed, the 302 V8 for everyday drivers, and the 351 Windsor for those who wanted enough torque to uproot a small tree. By the late 80s, fuel injection arrived, adding even more reliability without complicating repairs. The twin I-beam front suspension on two-wheel drive models and twin traction beam on four-wheel drive versions weren't perfect for hardcore off-roaders, but for street use, they were nearly unkillable. Transfer cases, like the Borg-Warner 1356, were mechanical, with manual shifters that didn't need electronics or vacuum lines. The tailgates used tried-and-true truck hardware, and even the spare tire carriers were overbuilt. Mid-80s models started getting galvanized body panels, slowing down the rust that plagued earlier Fords. And because they shared so many parts with the F-Series pickups, finding replacement components is still ridiculously easy. These Broncos weren't delicate showpieces. They were family wagons that could haul a boat on Saturday, tackle a muddy trail on Sunday, and carry you to work on Monday. Today, they're popular with off-roaders and classic truck fans, but you can still spot them working ranch duty or serving as hunting rigs in rural areas. They weren't flashy, they weren't fast, but they were tough enough to make it through decades of hard use and still keep rolling, which is exactly why they belong on this list. 1961-1967 Ford Econoline, first gen. Before vans became bloated, plastic-filled family haulers, the first generation Ford Econoline was pure function. Based on the Falcon platform, it was a unibody design, with the engine mounted between the front seats, an odd setup by today's standards, but one that made perfect sense in the early 60s. Engine options ranged from a modest 144ci inline-6 to the stronger 170ci and 240ci units. None of them made big power, but they didn't need to. These engines were understressed from the factory and could run for hundreds of thousands of miles with little more than oil changes and tune-ups. The unibody construction saved weight and eliminated frame rust issues. The suspension was dead simple, I-beam up front, leaf springs in the rear. The manual 3-speed and Ford-O-Matic automatic were both proven designs that could take years of abuse. The Econoline's simplicity was also its greatest strength. Mechanics could get to nearly every part of the engine from inside the cabin by popping the cover, meaning roadside repairs were actually possible. And because they shared so many parts with other Fords of the era, replacements were easy to find. These vans were bought by tradesmen, delivery companies, and small businesses, people who needed them to work every single day. Most were driven into the ground, but the ones that survived are a testament to how tough they were. Today, clean examples are rare, but even rough ones can be brought back to life with surprisingly little effort. It wasn't glamorous, but the first-gen Econoline was the kind of vehicle you could run for decades and still trust for one more job. 1983-1988 Ford Ranger with the 2.3 Lima 4-cylinder. The first-generation Ford Ranger wasn't just a scaled-down truck, it was a proof of concept that a compact pickup could be tough and dependable, and nothing embodied that better than the 2.3-liter Lima 4-cylinder. Originally developed in the mid-70s, the Lima engine had already proven itself in other Ford vehicles before landing in the Ranger. By 1983, Ford had ironed out every bug. With an iron block, iron head, and non-interference design, it could survive a broken timing belt without trashing the engine. Output was a modest 88 horsepower, but it was more than enough for light hauling and daily driving. The key was simplicity, a basic carburetor in early years, then electronic fuel injection later, both easy to maintain. Head gasket failures were rare, bottom ends were nearly indestructible, and parts availability was excellent. Most Rangers with this engine led unglamorous lives. Fleet trucks, worksite runabouts, first vehicles for teenagers. That actually helped their survival rate, because they were rarely driven hard. The 5-speed manual, sourced from Mazda, was perfectly matched to the engine's power band, and even the optional 4-speed automatic was reliable if serviced. The suspension was basic but durable, with leaf springs out back and Ford's twin I-beam setup in front. The interiors were Spartan but held up well, and nearly every component could be swapped with something from another Ford or Mazda product. Even today, it's not unusual to find these trucks still running with 300,000 miles on the clock. They're slow, yes, but they have a kind of stubborn durability that makes them beloved by the people who depend on them. 1968-1976 Ford Torino and Ranchero with the 351 Cleveland. The 351 Cleveland is one of those engines that lives in the shadow of its Windsor cousin, but ask anyone who owned one in a Torino or Ranchero and they'll tell you, this was an engine built to take punishment and keep on roaring. In its street form, especially the 2-barrel version, the Cleveland was almost impossible to kill. Making around 240 horsepower and 350 pound-feet of torque, it wasn't overstressed in everyday driving. The block was heavy-duty, the crankshaft strong, and the valve train robust enough to rack up serious mileage without drama. The Torino and Ranchero were perfect homes for it. Both cars were working-class heroes, not delicate muscle cars, but solid, usable machines. Rancheros had frames stout enough to handle real payloads, while Torinos offered sedan comfort with plenty of muscle under the hood. Transmissions like the C4 Automatic, FMX, or the top-loader 4-speed were proven and tough. The suspensions were conventional and simple to repair. Even when performance versions got more aggressive, most street-driven cars used mild cam profiles and lower compression, which only extended their life. Cooling systems could be marginal, a common Ford trait of the time, but with an upgraded radiator, overheating stopped being a worry. Keep the oil clean, and a Cleveland-powered Torino or Ranchero could easily run 200,000 miles or more. Today, these cars don't get the same collector attention as Mustangs, which means they can still be found at reasonable prices, but their durability is exactly why you still see them cruising to shows or pulling light duty on rural roads. The Cleveland wasn't just strong, it was a survivor, and in these cars, it proved it. 1948-1952 Ford F-Series, first gen. When Ford launched the first F-Series in 1948, they weren't aiming for style points. They were building a truck that could survive decades of hard labor. What they delivered was a machine so overbuilt that it became the blueprint for everything that followed. Power came from the legendary 239 CI flathead V8, an engine Ford had been refining for over 15 years. By the time it went into the F1, every weakness had been worked out. It wasn't fast, but it would run on lousy fuel, survive overheating, and keep going with minimal maintenance. The chassis was agricultural-grade tough. Thick steel frames, leaf springs all around, simple 3-speed manual gearboxes with a granny low first gear. These trucks were designed for hauling, towing, and farm duty. not for comfort, and certainly not for speed. Bodies were heavy-gauge steel that resisted denting, though rust eventually claimed many. But the beauty of these trucks was their simplicity. Almost every component could be rebuilt with hand tools, and the aftermarket for flathead parts is still massive today. When these trucks were worn out in commercial service, they often got passed down to farms, where they lived another lifetime as utility rigs. Even now, you can find first-gen F-Series trucks running around rural areas, working on their second or third rebuilt engine. They're crude, they're slow, and they ride like wooden wagons, but they are, without question, among the toughest trucks Ford ever built. 1978-1979 Ford LTD II with 302 or 351 Windsor. The late 70s weren't exactly a high point for performance, but if you were looking for a big, comfortable car that could outlast trends, the LTD II was your ride. Under the hood, you usually found either the 302 Ci or 351 Ci Windsor V8, both proven, long-lived engines with decades of development behind them. These motors weren't pushing the limits. Power was modest, emissions controls were basic, and compression was low. That meant less stress on the internals and longer life overall. The Windsor's simple pushrod design made it easy to service, and parts were, and still are, dirt cheap. The LTD II itself was a classic body-on-frame design, sharing components with other full-size Fords. That made it sturdy and easy to repair after a fender bender. The suspensions were soft but durable, built to handle rough roads without falling apart. Inside, the car was all about comfort. Big bench seats, simple controls, and not much to go wrong electrically. Even the automatic transmissions, usually C4 or FMX units, were known for being nearly indestructible with basic fluid changes. These cars often saw duty as family haulers, police cruisers, and taxi cabs. Many racked up staggering mileage without major mechanical failures. Today, they're underappreciated classics. They may not be collectible in the traditional sense, but their blend of durability, simplicity, and easy parts availability makes them one of the most dependable big cars Ford ever sold. 1975-1991 Ford E-Series 3rd Gen with 302 or 351 Windsor. If there was ever a vehicle that defined the term workhorse, it's the 3rd generation Ford E-Series van. Built from 1975 to 1991, these were the backbone of countless businesses, trades, and road trips. And when you popped the hood, or more accurately, lifted the doghouse inside, you'd usually find either the 302 Ci or 351 Ci Windsor V8 waiting to go to work. These engines were as dependable as they came. Low compression, simple carburation in the early years, then basic fuel injection later. Both setups were easy to maintain and nearly impossible to kill with regular oil changes. The Windsor design was already proven in trucks and cars, so dropping it into the E-Series meant you had a drivetrain that could handle abuse for hundreds of thousands of miles. The rest of the van was equally overbuilt. The frame was heavy-duty, the suspension could take years of overloaded tool racks or cargo, and the 3- and 4-speed automatics were truck-grade units like the C6. The steering and braking systems were straightforward and shared with other Ford trucks, which meant repairs were quick and parts were cheap. Econolines were everywhere. Plumbers, electricians, contractors, delivery companies, bands hauling gear from gig to gig. Most lived incredibly hard lives, yet they kept running long after they should have been scrap. Even when the bodies rusted, the drivetrains just kept going. Because they shared so many parts with F-Series pickups, replacement components are still easy to find today, and in a pinch, you could swap in a junkyard Windsor from almost any Ford of the era and be back on the road the same day. Comfortable? Not really. Fast? Not even close. But reliable? Absolutely. For over 15 years, the 3rd Gen E-Series proved that if you wanted a vehicle to keep earning its keep, Ford had just the van for the job. Modern cars might brag about software updates and self-parking features, but when it comes to sheer staying power, these old Fords are in a league of their own. They were built when over-engineered wasn't a bad word, and planned obsolescence was just an executive's bad dream. Which of these would you park in your garage for the end of the world? Drop your pick in the comments, hit that subscribe button, and keep celebrating the machines that just refuse to die.